All right, welcome back, folks. I am Socrates the Younger, and this is Autodidact University. Now, before we start here, because we've got another Seneca letter, this is letter 88, if I remember how to read Roman numerals. I was going to do a different letter, but I decided at the last second that letter was 15 pages long. And while it's a great topic, it talks about Seneca's idea of what the ancient Roman world was like. Now, I know that to us, he is from the ancient Roman world, but he's talking about the people who to him would have been the ancient Roman world. And it's a hilarious thing to listen to or to read because he sounds exactly like a modern day conservative pining for the era of the founding fathers. The difference being, of course, that in his time, the founding fathers would have been 750 years ago. So it's like if we could look back to the 1300s and be like, man, those people really knew how to get things done, you know? But anyway, that letter was just too long. It was too much. I really don't want to get like overwhelming and create 3.5 hour videos because no one wants to watch that. So I'm going to stick with something a little shorter here. This is letter 88. And it's about education, which I thought was appropriate. And before we dive into this, even though Seneca has some very strange ideas on education, which we'll get into, and I have some critiques because I disagree with Seneca here a little bit, but we'll get into that in a moment. The real thing I want to talk about before we do that is Autodidact University, because this is a project I've been thinking about for a long time, and I'm very much looking forward to creating it. So we're in the process of getting all the podcasting set up and all the branding done across the various platforms. We're going to hit as many different platforms as possible because I've just, I have a paranoia of saying something offensive and getting kicked off of something. So I want to be on a bunch of platforms. Not that I have any particularly noxious ideas kicking around in my brain. I'm a pretty nice guy most of the time. But, you can only watch so many people get kicked off of things before you start going, man, I really got to watch what I say. And people take that wrong. They go, oh, no. These are hateful people. These are people that are saying incorrect things. And I think, well, sometimes I'm angry. Sometimes I say things that if I said them in public would be considered offensive. And I know everybody does. Everybody says things when no one else is around that if you got up in front of a podium and said them, people would boo you. Because there's different standards for public and private utterances. And I'm doing my best here to just speak from the heart, and so I get concerned that I'm going to get all worked up and say something, and somebody's going to come along and go, look, he's full of hate. And then I'll end up with no way to reach you. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, I want to get the podcast going. We got a website getting set up. We're gonna do book stuff. Like you'll be able to buy books from us, and we'll recommend the books and read through the books and talk about the books. So if you want to get down and dirty with Seneca himself, you will be able to do so. And we want to run on a donations model, and I want to bring other people into this. This is not just about me sitting in front of a camera and talking, as much as, let's be honest, I love talking. I really want to see other people come in who have their own areas of expertise, people who are really good at something and want to sit and talk about it in a deep way for a long time. So if you're really looking to get the lowdown on some area, not so you can, make more money, not so you can post up your diploma on the wall and people will respect you, but if you really care about the knowledge, if you really care about enriching your life, like Seneca's going to talk about here, then Autodidact University is what you're looking for. And for that reason, I want to stick to a donations model. We'll get that set up once we get more people kind of involved here. And I want to get some other speakers involved as well. So if that's you, then hit me up, because we're on the lookout for new professors. New professors for Autodidact University. So I'm Socrates the Younger, the first professor. And today we're going to talk about Seneca's Letters from a Stoic, number 88. And we're going to break it into two parts because even this letter is quite long. So, just for those who haven't watched the other Seneca videos we've done, Lucius Annaeus Seneca is a 1st century Roman senator. That means he lives from the year 0 up between the year 0 and the year 100. I don't remember his exact dates. I think he was 70-something when he died. But he's a rough contemporary of Jesus. And he's an adherent of Stoic philosophy created in the 300s BC by Zeno and a number of Greek philosophers after him, notably Cleanthes and Chrysippus. and it focuses on separating myself from the circumstances of my life, recognizing the difference between things I can control and things I can't control. I've actually heard it put this way: if you want to sum up the Stoic philosophy in a single sentence, you can use the Christian serenity prayer, which says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And Seneca is famously, though he's one of the three big Roman Stoics, along with Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, the emperor and the slave, respectively. Seneca was an aristocrat and a senator. And in my humble opinion, he is the most fun to read, but of people actually practicing Stoicism, he is the worst of the three. He did not live up to his ideals, at least as far as he could have. But he does a better job of explaining them, and he's more fun to listen to, or read, I guess, since we can't listen to him anymore, than the other guys. So let's dive in here. This is letter 88, and it's on the topic of education. So, Seneca says to his nephew Lucilius, you want to know what my attitude is toward liberal studies. Well, I have no respect for any study whatsoever if its end is the making of money. Such studies are to me unworthy ones. They involve the putting out of skills to hire, and are only of value insofar as they may develop the mind without occupying it for long. Time should be spent on them only so long as one's mental abilities are not up to dealing with higher things. Wow, he is not very respectful. Anyway, they are our apprenticeship, he says, not our real work. Why liberal studies are so called is obvious. It is because they are the ones considered worthy of a free man, a liber in Latin. I actually mentioned this before, just to stop real quick. Liberal arts and a liberal comes from liber in Latin, meaning a free person, as opposed to a slave. So a liber, in the context of the ancient world, meant a citizen. And being a citizen, it's not like it is today, where you hit 18 and okay, you got the right to vote, you're a citizen. Being a citizen was considered, coming with citizenship was a whole slew of responsibilities. You were a person who was an active member of the life of the city. You were a full member, a VIP member, so to speak. And it meant you could vote in the tribunal elections. You could elect the tribunates. And you could also, petition the emperor, that sort of thing. You could own slaves. You would be the head of a household. If you were the oldest male member of a particular household, that meant you were the pater familias, which means father of the family, pater familias. And the pater familias was considered the emperor of his own little republic. I know that doesn't quite make sense. The emperor of his own little state, let's say. And the state that he was the emperor of was his own family. And so there was this idea of subsidiarity. The emperor rules over the state, the paterfamilias rules over the family in the same way. And so when they talk about liberal arts or liberal studies, these are the studies that are becoming of a free person who can be trusted with the responsibility of voting for what the state is going to do and who's going to lead the state. So, there is only really one liberal study that deserves the name, Seneca says, because it makes a person free, and that is the pursuit of wisdom. Its high ideals, its steadfastness in spirit make all other studies puerile and puny by comparison. Do you really think there is anything to be said for the others when you find among the people who profess to teach them quite the most reprehensible and worthless characters you could have as teachers? All right to have studied that sort of thing once, but not to be studying them now. This is very interesting. It makes me curious to think what Seneca would think of our current university system, in which a kind of self-proclaimed wisdom really has infiltrated every department. I heard a story about glaciology, the study of glaciers, and there was a group of some kind of activists who petitioned this glaciology department at this university to include, because basically the argument they made was that glaciology is historically a sexist discipline based on this kind of toxically masculine idea of going out and facing the elements to go travel to these Arctic places. Ernest Shackleton, the guy who tried to reach the South Pole on the ship Endurance, as far as they're concerned, he was basically suffering from male insecurity, let's call it, to be family friendly. And that's why he had to go do what he did. And Sir Edmund Hillary was the same thing. He was suffering from a lack of sufficient ego, and he had to go prove himself. And so these feminist activists argued that the best way to overcome that tendency towards sexism was to go to I guess the university had some museum, and they included in their glaciology exhibit, alongside, posters of how glaciers work and move and why we think they're actually melting, a feminist art exhibit. So I don't know if that counts as wisdom or not, but I know that Seneca said we should try to, wisdom is the only thing really worth pursuing, so maybe glaciology, he wouldn't have been such a fan of it in the first place. But either way, it's an interesting thing to think about. What would Seneca have said about our current university system? Would he think that our professors today are, among the people who profess to teach them, the most reprehensible and worthless characters? I don't know. He might not be popular in universities these days, maybe because of this. Anyway, he goes on and says, the question has sometimes been posed whether these liberal studies make a man a better person. But in fact, they do not aspire to any knowledge of how to do this, let alone claim to do it. Literary scholarship concerns itself with research into language, or history if a rather broader field is preferred, or, extending its range to the very limit, poetry. Which of these paves the way to virtue? Attentiveness to words, analysis of syllables, accounts of myths, laying down the principles of prosody being the analysis of poetic verse. So this is the laying down the principles of how to analyze poetry, which does sound kind of pointless when you put it that way. What is there in all this that dispels fear, roots out desire, or reins in passion? Or let us look at music, at geometry. You will not find anything in them which tells us not to be afraid of this or desire that, and if anyone lacks this kind of knowledge, all his other knowledge is valueless to him. The question is whether or not that sort of scholar is teaching virtue. For if he's not, he will not even be imparting it incidentally. Now, this is kind of a weird argument, and this is why I like doing these kind of things, because I can look back at this and say, Seneca, you may have lapsed from the good Stoic into just the grumpy old man here. Because let's be real, Roman writing at this time, from the 1st century on to about the 5th century when Rome fell apart, was absolutely rotten with people pining for the good old days. Things were so much better 300 years ago. We really knew how to live in those days. It's like if 90% of the American populace was the kind of old school Pat Buchanan conservative who really pines for the 1950s. But, times a million, because there were way more of them, and the time they were pining for was a really long time ago. Now, let's keep in mind that the advance of technology had not resulted in the vast cultural shifts that we've seen over the past 300 years. And so for them, 750 years ago, the time between Rome's founding and Seneca writing here, didn't really seem like as long of a time as 1776 seems from us. So, we live in a world that's so completely transformed that it's difficult for us to even say with a straight face, God, I wish that the Founding Fathers' time would come back. Even if you do look up to them and think that it's amazing that a group of people like that came together and all existed at the same time. If you're one of those not ultra-conservative, but one of those types of conservatives who feels that way. It's hard to say that, let's just go back to having muskets and cannons and sail around in ships that literally just sail. That seems impossible. For a Roman, the main change was that Rome had gotten richer. There were no transformative technological advances. Maybe shield technology had advanced and they had better spears than they did a few hundred years ago, but it wasn't such a major thing to say that, we were really better off 300 years ago when we weren't quite so rich, when we weren't the rulers of the world. So, he says the question is whether or not that sort of scholar is teaching virtue. And Seneca falls victim to this conservative thing. He falls victim to this pining for the old days. And so sometimes he comes off not so much as a philosopher as a grumpy old man. And I know I said Epictetus was the grumpy old man, but Seneca is an old man, and he is kind of grumpy. And there is an element of, oh, the kids these days in him. And so here, he's criticizing these teachers, and he's saying the question is whether or not that this sort of scholar is teaching virtue. Okay, so let's assume they're not teaching virtue. Let's say they're teaching, like, how to build statues. For if he's not, he will not even be imparting it incidentally. No one thought he was imparting it incidentally. No one claimed that. No one said, oh, if you learn to carve great statues, then you will be a very wise man. Though, actually, now that I think about it, there is something to be said for this, because I know that we have today, like, people will do things. They'll go out into the culture and say, well, listen, I'm a doctor, and therefore, since I treat people with gunshot wounds, therefore I'm qualified to opine on how we should interpret the Second Amendment. And it's like, hold on. We're very grateful to you for being a doctor and for healing people. That's fantastic. And if my question is, I've been shot, what should I do? I'm going to listen to you. But knowing how to staple bullet wounds closed, and this, I don't mean this as like disrespect to these doctors. All I'm saying is your area of expertise is not in what should the law about who gets to buy a gun should be. Those two things are separate. Like, we make the mistake, and I think maybe that is what he's talking about here. We make the mistake of thinking that because someone's got an advanced medical degree, that must mean they're a great person. That must mean they know a lot about everything. But it's really not true, because what they have is technical expertise. This doctor who treats gunshot wounds knows a lot about what different kinds of bullets do, and they can speak very powerfully on how a semi-automatic rifle with all this powder behind the slug is capable of creating a wound that's horror movie looking compared to your regular old .38 slug that goes in your little revolver that, you know, girls buy pink ones and keep them in their purses. That's useful information. That's great, but it doesn't qualify them to opine on the law, because that's a separate area of study, and they're not wise in all things. Just because you're a doctor doesn't mean you can tell me how to be a good person. So, let's go back to Seneca. If you really want to know how far these persons are from the position of being moral teachers, what we were just talking about, observe the absence of connection between all the things they study. If they were teaching one and the same thing, a connection would be evident. And I know if you're watching this, the word connection is spelled weird. I believe it's because my translation is British. You'll also notice that honorable is spelled with a U, which is a British thing. Other than that, I don't know of any difference between the word connection with a CT and connection with an X like you're seeing here. Unless they manage to persuade you that Homer was actually a philosopher, though they refute their case by means of the very passages which lead them to infer it. So there are people at the time, and he's going to talk about these in a second here, who thought of Homer, the guy who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, pretty much the Bible of the Roman world. It was like a combination Bible and pantheon of graphic novel superheroes. This is because it's weird. It's hard to understand for us today the position that the Iliad and the Odyssey, and also in Roman society, Virgil's Aeneid, held in the popular imagination. Because everybody would go back and reference them if you wanted to make a point. Like today, when we're in debate, somebody will say, like I think Mike Pence, the vice president, I don't remember what he was talking about, but in his speech he goes, we all know that Thomas Jefferson said the government is best which governs least. Now, side note, Thomas Jefferson, as far as we know, did not actually say that, but we understand what he's doing. And so, like, you can draw that quote out and everybody goes, oh, yeah, Thomas Jefferson. Okay, yeah, I know Thomas Jefferson. He's a great guy. Like, yeah, he's one of the people that created America, he created our culture. So, and you can do the same thing with movies. I can go quote The Dark Knight, or I can quote whatever, Saving Private Ryan, and be like, hey, you remember that moment when they were like something, 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 and then I come back and go, yeah, just like so-and-so said. And the Odyssey kind of occupied both places. It was both a foundational document insofar it was like the cultural document that everybody knew about. It was the movie that everybody had seen. And at the same time, it also contained these stories that were intimately woven in to the religion of the time. So it also functioned as a kind of Bible. Not that it outlined the nature of the world and where existence came from. That's all stuff that Christianity does. In this sense, it was like it outlined, not outlined, but it told stories about the various gods, and you could just go back. It was the cultural reference point for every single person in this world. It was the one thing that Greeks and Romans and Macedonians and Egyptians all had in common. They all knew who Homer was. They all knew the Iliad. They all knew the Odyssey. Most of them could quote it. In fact, there's a story that I got from actually a college class like 12 years ago, that these anthropologists in the 1970s they wanted to find out how reliable oral histories really are. So they went to these little fishing villages in Greece, and the Greek coastline is like mountains that go down into the ocean. And in places there are beaches. And so there's all these little islands. If you've ever seen a map of Greece, there's all these little islands coming off the top of it. It looks like a blanket in the process of being shredded. And so there's all these little fishing villages that are all very isolated and cut off from the world. And in the 1970s, there were guys who didn't know how to read. And these anthropologists, they went to these villages and they put cameras on the oldest people they could find in the villages. And they said, tell us the story of the Odyssey, or tell us the Iliad. And they would tell the story. And then what they did is they took the recordings, they transcribed them, and they compared them to the oldest extant manuscripts of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and they found that they were virtually identical. And keep in mind, these are not educated aristocrats. These are the illiterate hillbillies living in the middle of nowhere, right? In the United States, we have equivalents, and they are wearing MAGA hats and doing methamphetamine off of their ironing boards in their double-wide trailers. Those are the people that knew the Odyssey backwards and forwards. So we're not really going to get a good sense of what Seneca's talking about here unless we keep in mind the unique position that Homer held in Greco-Roman society. So unless, Seneca says, perhaps they managed to persuade you that Homer was actually a philosopher, though they refute their case by means of the very passages which lead them to infer it. For at one moment they make him a Stoic, giving nothing but virtue his approval, steering clear of pleasure, not even an offer of immortality inducing him to stoop to the dishonorable. At another they make him an Epicurean, praising the way of life of a society passing its days at peace and ease, in an atmosphere of dinner parties and music-making. At another he becomes a peripatetic, with a threefold classification of things good. At another, an academic, stating that nothing is certain. Now, just for some reference here, these are all real philosophical schools that existed at the time. Seneca considered himself a Stoic, and you see his little summary of Stoicism there. Nothing but virtue gets his approval. Steering clear of pleasure doesn't mean, like, we're not talking about the Buddha during his ascetic days, when he's sleeping on thorns and stuff like that. What they're talking about is Stoics are not distracted by pleasure. If a pleasurable experience comes to me, I say, oh, okay, great, thanks, God. And then when it passes away, I say, okay, it's time to do something else now. And I don't really get upset about it. I'm not like, oh, no, bring the fun times back. I need them. And I'm not afraid of, oh, things are going to get hard. I'm just even-keeled through the whole thing. I just look at it, look in front of me, and do what needs to be done according to my standards of morality and nobility, and I don't really worry about the rest of the world because I count the rest of the world among the things that ultimately I cannot control. And that description, by the way, is exactly why I'm talking about this, because that philosophy is so incredibly relevant, and I've moved all the way back to the beginning now of the document. So let's go down a little bit. That understanding, that Stoic understanding of we have to divide the world up into things I can change and things I can't change, and I can't worry about the things I can't change. I can't, like a Stoic, you wouldn't see a Stoic at a street protest. Because they're like, look, this is not something I can deal with. All I can do is what's right. If you're out there in the street holding signs and doing whatever, you're trying to change something that it's not up to you to change. And yes, I know the right of protest is written into the Constitution, blah, 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 blah. Stoicism is not a legal doctrine. And the First Amendment it's a legal thing. It's about the people have the right to peaceably assemble if they see fit, right? And we can argue about what that actually constituted. Did they really mean protesting with signs? Because I don't know that there was a lot of protesting with signs going on in the 18th century. So the point is, though, the Stoic clearly defines I can control myself, I can control my actions, I can control my attitudes and my thoughts. And I should control them according to the dictates of what I understand to be virtue. And so the task of a Stoic, as Seneca is actually referencing here, is to seek wisdom, is to understand what I can control and what I can't control. Wisdom says, here's what I should do with the things I can control. I should not get distracted by pleasure. I should not get distracted by pain. That's the worthwhile pursuit as far as the Stoic is concerned, and that's what this whole letter is about. Now, he contrasts that with the Epicureans, who come from Epicurus, and as we mentioned in the last video, Epicurean does not mean obsessed with food, even though that's what it means now, but it's not surprising that they would end up being referred, the word Epicurean would end up referring to someone who's obsessed with food, because of Seneca's summary of what the Epicureans are here, praising the way of life of a society passing its days at peace and ease, in an atmosphere of dinner parties and music making. Now, that's not entirely the Epicurean philosophy. I think for Seneca, that's the stuff that Homer talks about that sounds Epicurean, because the Epicureans were also the world's first, maybe not the first, but the world's first humanist atheists. They said, if there are any gods, they don't interfere in human affairs. They don't care. You can't show me miracles. I've never seen a miracle. No one's ever actually seen a miracle. If someone tells you they've seen something supernatural, aka something that defies the laws of nature, they're lying to you. There are probably no gods, and if they are, they don't care about us. They don't interfere in human affairs. That's Epicureanism. And so for the Epicureans, because there's no grander anything out there's nothing really transcendent in the Epicurean philosophy. As far as they're concerned, pleasure is the highest good. And they argue that if you go for extreme pleasures, if I drink 20 bottles of vodka, because, it's pleasurable to drink lots of vodka, I'm going to wake up the next day and puke my guts out. And the Epicureans look at that very philosophically and say, maybe if you add up all the pleasure and pain, drinking 20 bottles of vodka is actually not very pleasurable. It just seems very pleasurable. So in fact, the greatest pleasures are the moderate pleasures. And he outlines these moderate pleasures right here. Peace and ease, an atmosphere of dinner parties and music making. So that's the Epicureanism. Then we move on to the Peripatetics. Now, peripatetic is also a word that is in use today. Generally, if you have tenure and you spend your time in libraries, it's the sort of word you would use. But a peripatetic is someone who walks around. Like if you're pacing back and forth, you are a peripatetic. And the Peripatetics come from Aristotle's Lyceum, where Aristotle would teach by walking around, and his students would follow after him going, okay, yeah, I see, I understand. And Aristotle is thought of as the world's first scientist. He's also thought of as the last man ever to live who knew everything that could be known, but that's not really important here. What's important here is that he outlines the Aristotelian philosophy as a threefold classification of things good. So science and philosophy were not really separated yet at this point. You could find the same dude arguing about ethics and about the nature of geometry and how to calculate the distance of the stars, which he's going to talk about in a second. And that was all the same discipline. It wasn't like in our era has been characterized over the last 100 years that disciplines in science and the academic world have been increasingly chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces. To the point that, in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, people were beginning to talk about a crisis of specialization, insofar as the disciplines had become so specialized that even if I'm an astrophysicist, that doesn't mean I understand astrophysics. It means I understand 1% of 1% of 1% of astrophysics in my very narrow, tiny little area. And if I really get going on the stuff that I know about, there's like 12 other people in the world who actually understand what I'm talking about. So if you want to build technology with that kind of knowledge, it's great. But if you, as a person, want to attend autodidact university and get a broad understanding of how astrophysics works and what it means for me, just some dude, you can't really do it because nobody understands the whole thing because everybody's super specialized. So they had the opposite problem in that nothing was specialized and everybody's just kind of opining on whatever. So you see that the peripatetics, even though Aristotle was a more scientific, he was an empiricist, he was into like collecting biological samples, and he had all these theories about what fossilized fish actually were. He thought there were fish that swam through rocks, the way fish swim through water, and that fossils were the bones of those fish or creatures. So they have a threefold classification, the scientific obsession with classifying everything. So that's the peripatetics, and then the academics come from Plato's Academy. These are Platonists, and Platonists, as opposed to Aristotelians, are mystical, or at least relatively speaking. Because you have Plato's ideas of the forms, where he says that if I see 20 different cats, even if they're all different colors, different sizes, one of them's got no tail, the other one's missing an ear, the other one is missing a leg, I still recognize that they all fit this basic idea of cat, which I have in my head. And Plato says, okay, where did that idea of cat come from? And he basically ends up theorizing that there's kind of this realm out there, which is where we all were before we were born. And it's the realm of the forms. It's the realm of the absolute, you might say, where there is this absolute idea of cat, which is the most cat-like cat that has ever catted. So that's the academics, and they state that nothing is certain. That I don't think that idea is actually in Plato. I think that's a development since, because you got to keep in mind, Plato was 300 years ago at this point. Aristotle was like 270 years ago. So the academics may very well have come up with new ideas. I have not seen anywhere in Plato that he says nothing is certain, other than him quoting Socrates saying, "I know that I know nothing," which is a little different. But anyway, let's get back to Homer and Seneca here, because what we are talking about is people, to go back, professors of Homeric studies, you might call them, who are at one moment making Homer a Stoic, at another moment making him an Epicurean, at another moment making him a peripatetic, and at another moment making him an academic. He can be all of these things. It is obvious, Seneca says, that none of these philosophies is to be found in Homer, for the very reason that they all are, the doctrines being mutually incompatible. You can't be both a peripatetic and a Stoic at the same time. Even suppose we grant that Homer was a philosopher. He became a wise man, surely, before he could recite any epics. Okay, weird phraseology. I kind of thought he was just being a grumpy old man and forcing his logic to fit into his grumpiness when I first read this. But now, when I went back to it and read it again, what I saw was he became a wise man before he could recite epics. What he really means is it's like a logical thing he's doing here. He's saying, okay, if Homer is a wise man and we can absorb his wisdom by reading his epics, it means he didn't become wise after he wrote them, or his wisdom wouldn't be in them. It means also that he didn't become wise while he was writing them, because then at least part of them would not have that wisdom in them. And if they don't have wisdom in them, as Seneca's already said, they're not worth talking about. So we have to assume that Homer was already some kind of wise man when he sat down and wrote the epics. Otherwise, these people who study the epics and say Homer is a wise man would have no reason to believe that he was a wise man. So, even suppose, as Seneca says, we grant that Homer was a philosopher. He became a wise man, surely, before he could recite any epics. So that what we should be learning are the things which made him wise. Now, this is where I have problems with Seneca at this point, because Seneca seems to think that the only way to get wise is to read philosophical books, mostly by Epicurus for some reason. He references Epicurus way too much for somebody who's reading Stoics. And hanging out around philosophical people and ostensibly talking about philosophy. So Seneca, I think, lacks an appreciation in his grumpy old manness for the ways in which narrative, the ways in which story structure can impart lessons about the world. Like I've said before that I feel like, well, not I feel like, that's not right. I've said before that it is the case that fiction, fictional narrative, mythological stories that are patently untrue or that contain obviously false elements, dragons and hydras and people floating through the air and God wrestling with people in the Old Testament, those stories still convey meaning. And in fact, they convey meaning in a more powerful way than bullet points do. A good story can contain more complex information than even the most complicated and lengthy PowerPoint presentation. And it's absorbed at a level at which PowerPoint presentations are not absorbed. Like PowerPoint presentations, and by PowerPoint presentations, I mean like the logical presentation of facts or of ideas. And say, here, bullet point, here's my idea. Bullet point A, here's part 1. Bullet point 2, here's the next part. Bullet point C, here's the other part. And these all fit together and create this idea. That operates in my prefrontal cortex, right? The part that talks. The part that is a thinking being. But I'm not driven, my behavior is not driven by my thoughts. If I get angry and my prefrontal cortex all but shuts down, I'm still going to do stuff. In fact, I'm going to do really insane stuff. But you can't say that I've now stopped thinking because my prefrontal cortex has stopped functioning. I have other parts of me that in fact motivate my behavior far more than the thinking part of me does. I would say that really the limbic system has a lot more to do with why I do the things I do. People don't act rationally. That's why anarcho-capitalism for a lot of people doesn't work. Because people are not rational actors who seek to maximize value and minimize cost. People are emotional actors who are all too happy to buy the exact same clothes for 10 times the price because it has a different label on it. That's emotional thinking. That's not rational thinking. Right? So Homer could very well have great lessons in him. And in fact, the idea that so many people read him and so many people found value in this that they continue to talk about it is perhaps a waypost that points to there's something in there that is meaningful to people, that has some truth in it about life. Just because it's not stated in the form of thou shalt doesn't mean there's nothing there. And I don't think Seneca really appreciates that. So, but anyway, let's go back to Seneca because we're not going to give up on him yet. And so he says, and there is no more point in my investigating which was the earlier, Homer or Hesiod. Hesiod was the other major Greek poet, not quite as big a deal as Homer, but still a pretty big deal. Then there would be in my knowing the reason why Hecuba, though younger than Helen, carried her years so unsuccessfully. So, in case you didn't pick up on that, Hecuba is Helen's younger sister. Helen being the most beautiful woman in the world, kidnapped and or seduced by Paris, depending on which version of the story you read. And she was stolen away from her husband, and Paris, played by Orlando Bloom in the movie version, runs off with her back to Troy. The Greeks come following after, and the Trojan War begins. And you have 10 years of a siege of Troy to get this lady back. And also because a lot of the Greeks were like, oh, really? A reason to go to war? Let's go raid people and steal their stuff. Because again, people are not rational actors, but emotional ones. So Hecuba is the younger sister of Helen, but for some reason she's just not, she's not the ultimate beauty, even though Helen's a little bit older and the Greeks are shamelessly objectifying women, apparently. But anyway, and what? Seneca says, I would ask this kind of scholar, do you suppose is the point of trying to establish the ages of Patroclus and Achilles? For those who don't know, Patroclus is Achilles, like his sidekick, his best friend. Some people have said they were lovers, and Patroclus is a dude, so Achilles is now gay, and Patroclus is his lover. It doesn't actually say that, it's just inferred because when Patroclus is killed, Achilles goes into he goes in rage mode, and he starts murdering people left and right when he's in this state where he's like impervious to being hurt. Anyway, Seneca says, and are you more concerned to find out where Ulysses' wanderings took him than to find a way of putting an end to our own perpetual wanderings? We haven't the time to spare to hear whether it was between Italy and Sicily that he ran into a storm, or somewhere outside the area of the world we know. Wanderings as extensive as his could never have in fact taken place inside so limited an area. When every day we're running into our own storms, spiritual storms, and driven by vice into all the troubles that Ulysses ever knew. We're not spared those eye-distracting beauties or attackers. We too have to contend in various places with savage monsters reveling in human blood, insidious voices that beguile our ears, shipwrecks, and all manner of misfortune. So, those who don't know the story of the Odyssey, Ulysses, or Odysseus in the Greek version, has to go through all these different trials. He spends 10 years trying to get back from Troy after the fall of Troy to his own home, where his wife, Penelope, is waiting for him. And so he has to go past the sirens who sing so beautifully and are so beautiful that no man can possibly resist them. And he has to defeat the Cyclops, and he has to do this, that, and the other. And Seneca wonders what the point of reading about all that is when I have my own version of Ulysses' troubles. I have my own sirens who are distracting me from being a good person. I have my own Cyclops who's trying to eat me in the world. And we all do. He's not wrong there. Every person walking around in the world, unless you are the Buddha and you're watching this, in which case, congratulations to me, what an accomplishment, then you do. There are things in your life that are unresolved. There are things that are distracting you that shouldn't distract you. Maybe your smartphone is the eye-distracting beauty. Or attackers. Maybe when you get on that smartphone, people are heckling you on social media because they don't like you, or you are too fat in the swimsuit picture you posted. Whatever. We're all dealing with it. And Seneca's wondering what the point of talking about Ulysses is when we all have these immediate problems that we need immediate help with. I'm still thinking that those stories can be helpful. Maybe not the Iliad and the Odyssey, because Ulysses mostly overcomes his problems by tricking his enemies and sacrificing his own soldiers. He's definitely not the paragon of wisdom or justice or anything like that. In fact, he's always referred to as wily old Odysseus, wily old Ulysses. He's cunning and crafty. He is the guy who came up with the idea of the Trojan horse. So that's the guy we're dealing with here. So anyway, what you should be teaching me, Seneca says, is how I may attain such a love for my country, my father and my wife. That's Odysseus. He loved his country, he loved his father, he loved his wife, so on and so forth. And keep on course for those ideals even after shipwreck. Why go into the question whether or not Penelope completely took in her contemporaries? Because when Odysseus gets back, Penelope is surrounded by suitors who are trying to marry her and take all of Odysseus' wealth, by the way. Completely took in her contemporaries and was far from being a model of wifely purity, any more than the question whether or not she had a feeling that the man she was looking at was Ulysses when he appeared to her in disguise. When he came back, he was going to defeat the suitors, so he showed up in his house in a disguise, and Penelope recognized him. Teach me instead what my purity is. Teach me instead what purity is, how much value there is in it, whether it lies in the body or the mind. That's an interesting, what he's really saying there, it'd be easy to read in some kind of like modern sexual mores there, saying purity is a mental thing and you can do what you want with your body. What he really means is that purity of the body, as it's understood, is a product of a state of mind. If I'm in a proper state of mind, like if I am a devoted Catholic, I'm not going to go out and have sex with 20 different women. If I'm really committed to what I believe, it's up here, he says. Everything is up here for Seneca. The body is, there's actually one of these letters where he talks about don't spend too much time exercising because you'll start to get focused on your body. And you need to be focused on your mind. Get back to things that improve your mind as quickly as possible, Seneca says, and don't spend too much time worrying about your health. So, Seneca says, turning to the musical scholar, I say this: you teach me how bass and treble harmonize, or how strings producing different notes can give rise to concord. I would rather you brought about some harmony in my mind and got my thoughts into tune. You show me which are the plaintive keys, the sad keys, like the minor keys. I would rather you showed me how to avoid uttering plaintive notes, moaning and crying, when things go against me in life. Now, look, Seneca, you gotta calm down, dude. Like, some people just want to learn how to play music. It's not like there's more to life than just studying philosophy. Studying philosophy is great, but I can't wait until I become Socrates himself. Socrates the elder, I mean, the original Socrates, before I am allowed to go learn how to play the piano. And maybe it might even be the case that acquiring the discipline of mind necessary to go learn the piano will help me when I sit down to study wisdom. I can do both, and the musical scholar has nothing on him that says that he has to be a teacher of wisdom. It's nice if he is wise, but I mean, I can go learn how to do something from some guy who's a piece of garbage, and then I say, okay, thank you for teaching me, goodbye now, and I'm going to leave. And I'm not going to be influenced by his take on wisdom, even if he's like a disgusting, like, misogynist person who's like, yeah, huge butts are my favorite thing. I'm like, no, calm down, teach me to play the piano so I can leave and not listen to your nonsense. Anyway, moving on from the musical scholar. Seneca says, the geometrician teaches me how to work out the size of my estates, rather than to work out how much a man needs in order to have enough. Okay, how much should I consider enough? Like, the concept of having enough is an awesome concept that I will gladly talk for a long time about. But same criticism here, and he's going to go through a couple of these, and it's all of the same character. He brings up a profession, says the geometrician teaches me how to do this, the so-and-so teaches me how to do that, and then some little clever thing where he's like, how do I work out the size of my estates? That's pointless unless I know how much is enough for me. And then he basically like goes through it and says, geometry is useless. Here's what's actually useful. And what's actually useful is, guess what? Wisdom. He teaches me to calculate, Seneca says, putting my fingers into the service of avarice, instead of teaching me that there is no point whatsoever in that sort of computation, and that a person is none the happier for having properties which tire accountants out, or to put it another way, how superfluous a man's possessions are, when he would be a picture of misery if you forced him to start counting up single-handed how much he possessed. So you're not, just because you have so many dollars in the bank that if you had to count them up yourself, you would cry because it would be an interminable task, you're still not any happier. And this is actually reflected in scientific literature. More money does bring more happiness, up to a point. Once I have enough money to cover all of my basic needs, and I can go about and live basically a normal life, with all of the regular amenities that regular people have, if I can feed my kids and buy their school clothes and the heat and the water and the electricity stay on, and I've got enough money to buy food, maybe go out to eat every so often, make the car payment, put something in savings, any more money, my income rising after that, produces less and less and less happiness each time it rises. So going from being a millionaire to being a billionaire, in theory, doesn't make you any happier. It just looks good on TV. And that is true. That's a good point. Even if Seneca's being an annoying old man right now. What use is it to me, Seneca says, to be able to divide a piece of land into equal areas if I'm unable to divide it with a brother? Oh, Seneca, aren't you just hilarious? Anyway, what is the ability to measure out a portion of an acre with an accuracy extending even to the bits which elude the measuring rod, if I'm upset when some high-handed neighbor encroaches slightly on my property? The geometrician teaches me how I may avoid losing any fraction of my estates, but what I really want to learn is how to lose the lot and still keep smiling. That's something we could probably benefit from, and insofar as Seneca's talking about the problems in society of focusing on these things, focusing on how to calculate my estates at the expense of knowing how to handle the situation where I lose everything, then he's absolutely right. And we'll put up with his very lengthy example after example of this, because the point is so important. But if he's just saying, oh, geometricians should all teach ethics, wisdom, no. What we shouldn't do is focus on these things and think that because, like, we think in our society if somebody's a billionaire, they must be really smart. They must, like, know something. You know, like Donald Trump wrote a book called Trump, How to Think Like a Billionaire. First of all, the book is called Trump, and it's by a guy named Trump. The same guy who said that his foreign policy advisors would be me, myself, and I. So that's neither here nor there, though. But we seem to think that because he's got lots of money, there must be something about him. He must be a smart guy. Oh, Bill Gates, he must be a smart guy. He must be a great dude because he's got $800 zillion. We should look up to our athletes as moral paragons, and we should listen to them when they lecture us on morality. Because they're sports stars. Seneca would have a heart attack if he saw the way we treat our athletes nowadays. He probably actually would find it eerily familiar because it sounds a lot like the way people treated the most famous gladiators at the time, or the famous mercenaries who fought in the arena. It was the same basic idea. I don't think they moralized and lectured the Roman populace on how they should be living the way our athletes do. But it was the same idea that they were like worshipped as these kind of like people to be emulated. When, unless you're trying to become a famous basketball player, LeBron James has really not done anything to warrant your worship. He's not an exemplary person relative to the rest of us. He's just got a lot of money and fame. He hasn't done anything else. You know what I mean? Anyway, lose the lot and keep smiling. But, Seneca says, but I'm being turned off the land my father and grandfather owned before me. Well, so what? Who owned the land before your grandfather? Are you in a position to identify the community, let alone the individual, to whom it originally belonged? You entered on it as a tenant, not an absolute owner. Whose tenant, you may ask? Your heirs, and that only if you're lucky. Took me a second to understand that sentence, by the way. You are a tenant on the land. I get it when he first says it, but then he says you are your heir's tenant. What he means is that even if you hold on to the land for your whole life, eventually you're going to die. And eventually your heir is going to take over the property. You're going to leave it to someone and then it's their property. And so basically, when the time comes, you have to get off the property so the new owner can take over. And you get off the property in this example by dying. I'm assuming this was clearer in the original Latin and that maybe this is the translator's fault. But that's neither here nor there. The legal experts say, Seneca says, that acquisition by prescription never applies where the property concerned is actually public property. So this is when, like, the Roman government would hand out pieces of public property to people. It didn't say, you farm this area, this is your area now. And so the legal experts, as Seneca is telling us, they say that acquisition by prescription, the government giving you land, doesn't apply where the property concerned is actually public property. I can't, and also, if the government gives you that land, I can't leave that to my children. Because it's like, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to the government. It's public property. Or what you possess, Seneca says, and call your own, is really public property. Or mankind's property, for that matter. We could take that even a step further and say mankind does not own the earth. Like, where we got that idea is beyond me. But really the property is just there. Maybe you're owned by the property. Maybe you're a slave to the land. And the land has decided to kick you off. This is not a Stoic idea. This is me talking. But anyway, Seneca. Oh, the marvels of geometry. You geometers can calculate the areas of circles, can reduce any given shape to a square, can state the distances separating stars. Nothing's outside your scope when it comes to measurement. Well, if you're such an expert, measure a man's soul. Tell me how large or how small that is. You can define a straight line. What use is that to you if you've no idea what straightness means in life? All right, this is too many examples, Seneca. Let's move on to something else. Oh, look, that's exactly what he's doing. I come now to the person who prides himself on his familiarity with the heavenly bodies. And we have a quote from Virgil's Georgics here, depending on your pronunciation. And it says, toward which quarters chilly Saturn draws the orbits in which burning Mercury roams. And this is referring to astrologers, by the way, not astronomy. Astrology being the study of the stars for the specific purpose of trying to know what the future's going to be. And Seneca says, what is to be gained from this sort of knowledge? Am I supposed to feel anxious when Saturn and Mars are in opposition or Mercury sets in the evening in full view of Saturn? Instead of coming to learn that bodies like these are equally propitious wherever they are, and incapable of change in any case, they are swept on in a path from which they cannot escape, their motion governed by an uninterrupted sequence of destined events, making their reappearances in cycles that are fixed. They either actuate or signalize all that comes about in the universe. That's a weird sentence, and I'm assuming the Latin was clearer. What he's saying is the planets don't move around in order to tell us what's going to happen next. They're on their own orbits, and they're moving based on physical laws. Surprisingly advanced, no? And he said it's dumb to think that the planets dictate what's going to happen here, and that if, Mercury's in retrograde this month, that I should be freaking out. And this is actually what you might call Stoic astrophysics, which was not super popular among the Romans. The Greeks were more into that because the Greeks were more philosophical anyway. The Romans were the more practical of the Greco-Roman world. You can kind of think of the Greeks as the British and the Romans as the Americans, where the Greeks are a little bit more interested in culture, a little bit more interested in sophisticated philosophical thought, whereas the Romans, aka Americans, are like, how do I build it? How do I make money off of it? All right, is it going to be popular? And the rest is, who cares? So Seneca says, if every event is brought about by them, the planets, how is mere familiarity with a process which is unchangeable going to be of any help? If they are pointers to events, what difference does it make to be aware in advance of things you can't escape? What's the point of knowing something if I can't do anything about it? They're going to happen, Seneca says, whether you know about them or not. And then we have another quote from Virgil. If you observe the lasting sun and watch the stars processing through the skies, the day that follows will not prove you wrong, nor will deceptive cloud-free nights then take you in. I know it sounds like it's saying that you should practice astrology. What he means is if you pay attention during the day to your life, then you can make accurate predictions about what's going to happen just by looking around. Nor will you need to stand under the cloud-free sky at night and stare at the stars trying to figure out what the future is going to be. I've taken sufficient precautions, Seneca says, more than sufficient precautions, to ensure that I'm not taken in by deceptive phenomena. At this you'll protest. Can you really say the day that follows never proves me wrong? Surely anything that happens which one didn't know in advance was going to happen proves one wrong. Well, I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know what's capable of happening, and none of this will give rise to any protest on my part. I'm ready for everything. If I'm let off in any way, I'm pleased. The day in question proves me wrong in a sense if it treats me leniently. But even so, not really wrong, for just as I know that anything is capable of happening, so also do I know that it's not bound to happen. So the point he's making here is I'm ready for anything because I'm a Stoic and I can handle both pleasure and pain and maintain my equanimity and not be distracted, not be thrown off, so I can act with reason and do the right thing when it's put in front of me no matter what situation I'm in. There's always the right thing to do, so it doesn't matter what happens. And that's important. Because there's always like, well, what if this? What if that? It doesn't matter for the Stoics. I'm going to continue to do the right thing. I'm not even going to pay attention to what's going on out there. I'm just going to do the right thing. I'm going to do the next right thing right in front of me. And when I'm done doing that, I'm going to do the right thing after that. And so he ends with a phrase that we've all probably heard. So I look for the best, Seneca says, and am prepared for the opposite. Expect the best, Seneca says. Or hope for the best, Seneca says, and expect the worst. And I ruined my sign-off doing that. Anyway, thank you for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with part 2 of this Senecal letter.